Chapter 7. The Soviet Republic. The Soviet organization was a product of the Russian Revolution of 1905. At that time the proletariat engaged in mass action, for which it required a form of mass organization. The secret organization of the Social Democrats, as also of the Social Revolutionaries, only comprised hundreds of members who influenced some thousands of workers. Political and industrial mass organizations could not be formed under the absolutism of the Tsar. The only mass organizations of the workers which existed when the revolution came were those which had been brought into existence by the capitalists themselves and related to single trades. These new became mass organizations for the struggle of the proletariat. Each trade was now transformed from a place where material production was carried on into a place of political propaganda and action. The workers of each trade came together and chose delegates, who united to form a council of delegates, or a Soviet. It was the Mensheviks who gave the impulse to this most significant movement. Thus a form of proletarian organization was created, which became the most comprehensive of all because it included all wage earners. It made powerful action possible, and left a deep impression in the consciousness of the worker. When the Second Revolution broke out in March 1917, the Soviet organization again came to the fore, and this time upon a firmer basis, corresponding with the development undergone by the proletariat since the First Revolution. The Soviets of 1905 were local organizations confined to single towns. Those of 1917 were not only more numerous, but closely knit together. Single Soviets were affiliated to a greater body, which in its turn was part of an organization comprehending the whole empire, its organ being the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, and a permanent central executive committee. Already the Soviet organization can look back on a great and glorious history. A more important period lies before it, and not in Russia alone. Everywhere it is apparent that the usual methods of the political and economic struggle of the proletariat are not sufficient to cope with the enormous strength at the disposal of finance capital in the economic and political spheres. These methods need not be abandoned, as they are essential for ordinary conditions, but at times they are confronted with tasks to which they are not equal, and success is only likely with a combination of all the economic and political power of the proletariat. The Russian Revolution of 1905 brought the idea of the mass strike to a head in the German social democracy. This fact was recognized by the 1905 Congress. That of 1906 endeavored to allay the sensibilities and fears of the trade union officials. On the question of the mass strike, it resolved that when the executive should consider the necessity for the political mass strike to exist, it should get into touch with the General Commission of the trade unions, and concert all measures necessary to secure successful action. After all our experience with the mass strike, we know today that this resolution was fundamentally wrong. For one reason, because a mass strike is likely to be all the more successful by breaking out unexpectedly in a particular situation, with spontaneous suddenness. Its organization by party and trade union machinery would make necessary such preparations as would lead to its frustration. We, therefore, understand why the trade union bureaucracy tends to oppose all spontaneous action on a large scale. Trade unions are absolutely necessary. The proletariat is the stronger the greater the number of its members, and the larger the financial resources of its trade unions. Widespread and permanent organizations, with many ramifications, are not possible without a machinery for permanent administration, that is a bureaucracy. The trade union bureaucracy is as essential as the trade union itself. It has its faults like parliamentarism and democracy, but is as indispensable as these for the emancipation of the proletariat. This is not, however, to say that all its pretensions must be recognized. It should be restricted to its first function, in performing which it cannot be replaced, that is the administration of trade union funds, the extension of organization, and the giving advice to the workers in their struggles. But it is unsuitable for leading that powerful mass strike which tends to become the characteristic of the times. By virtue of their experience and knowledge, Trade union officials and parliamentarians may here successfully assist, but the initiative tends to fall into the hands of workshop committees. In various countries outside Russia, such as in England, these institutions, shop stewards, have played a big part in mass struggles, side by side with ordinary trade unionism. The Soviet organization is, therefore, one of the most important phenomena of our time. It promises to acquire an outstanding significance in the great decisive struggles between capital and labor which are before us. Can we ask even more than this of the Soviets? The Bolshevists, who, together with the left-wing social revolutionaries, obtained a majority in the Russian workers' councils after the November Revolution of 1917, after the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, proceeded to make an organ of government of the Soviets, which hitherto had been the fighting organization of a class. They did away with the democratic institutions which had been conquered by the Russian people in the March Revolution. Quite properly the Bolsheviks ceased to call themselves Social Democrats, and described themselves as communists. Indeed, they did not repudiate democracy entirely. In his speech of April 28, Lenin described the Soviet organization as a higher type of democracy, a complete break with its bourgeois distortion. Entire freedom was now secured to the proletarian and the poor peasant. Hitherto democracy had connoted equal political rights for all citizens. The sections privileged by law had always possessed freedom of movement. But one does not call that democracy. The Soviet Republic is to be the organ of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the only means, as Lenin expresses it, whereby the most painless transition to socialism is made possible. This is to be done by depriving of political rights all those who are not represented in the Soviets. Why should this step make less painful the transition to socialism than would be the case with universal suffrage? Obviously, because the capitalists are in this way excluded from the making of laws. Now there are two alternatives. Suppose the capitalists and their supporters are an insignificant handful. How could they then prevent the transition to socialism under universal suffrage? On the contrary, universal suffrage would reveal them as an insignificant minority, and consequently they would the sooner resign themselves to their fate than if the franchise were so shaped that no one could say with certainty which party had behind it a majority of the people. In reality, however, the capitalists cannot be deprived of rights. What is a capitalist in a legal sense? A possessor. Even in a country so highly developed economically as Germany, where the proletariat is so numerous, the establishment of a Soviet republic would disfranchise great masses of the people. In 1907, the number of men, with their families, belonging to occupations which comprised the three great groups of agriculture, industry, and trade, that is, wage earners and salaried persons, amounted to something over 35 million, as against 17 million belonging to other sections. A party could therefore very well have the majority of wage earners behind it and yet form a minority of the population. On the other hand, when the workers vote together, they need not fear the united votes of their opponents, by obliging them to fight their common foes. Universal suffrage causes them to close up their ranks sooner than if the political struggle were confined to the Soviets, from which the opponents are excluded, and in which the political struggle of a socialist party takes the form of attacking another socialist party. Instead of class consciousness, sectarian fanaticism is thereby induced. Now for the other alternative. Suppose the capitalists and their supporters are not a small minority, but a great mass which is well able, in a parliament elected on the basis of universal suffrage, to constitute a respectable opposition? What purpose would be served by reducing this opposition to silence in the governing body? The capitalists themselves are everywhere only a small section. But in comparison with the socialists, their supporters may be very numerous. It should not be thought that only personal interest or payment would induce people to enter the lists for capitalism. Except socialism, capitalism is today the only possible method of production on a large scale. Who holds socialism to be impossible, must, if he thinks in a modern sense at all, be for capitalism, even if he be not interested therein. Even of those backward sections, who are opposed to capitalism, many take their stand on the basis of private property in the means of production, and therefore on the basis on which capitalism grows. In a backward country, therefore, the number of those in the population who directly or indirectly would protect capitalism may be very large. Their opposition would not be lessened if they were deprived of political rights. They would all the more energetically oppose the measures of the new tyrannical regime. By universal suffrage in a real democracy, all classes and interests are represented in the governing body according to their strength. Every section and party may exercise the fullest criticism upon each bill, show up all its weaknesses, and also make known the strength of the opposition which exists amongst the people. In the Soviet, all hostile criticism is excluded, and the weaknesses of laws do not come so easily to light. The opposition which they arouse amongst the population do not learned in the first instance. Only afterwards, when the law is promulgated, do criticism and opposition manifest themselves. Instead of during the debates, the weaknesses of laws come to light when they are put into operation. Even the Soviet government has already, in the case of very important laws, been obliged, by supplements and lax administration, to let in by the back door elements that it solemnly threw out of the front door. That, as compared with general suffrage, vote by occupation has a tendency to narrow the outlook of the electors, we have already shown. That by this means the transition to socialism is rendered painless is very much in doubt. Not less doubtful is the dictatorship of the proletariat under the Soviet regime. Dictatorship, certainly. But of the proletariat? In the economic structure of Russia, the Soviets could only attain the position of rulers in 1917 by not confining themselves to the industrial proletariat of the towns, as in 1905. This time the soldiers and peasants were also organized in Soviets. With the disbanding of the army, the soldiers have lost their numerical importance. The small army raised by the people's commissaries was more useful to them, from the point of view of bayonets than of votes. Nevertheless, the votes of the Red Army have played a considerable part. In some Soviets, for example, at the latest elections in Petrograd, the major portion of the mandates were reserved to its members. Of much more importance, however, were the votes of the peasants, who comprise the great majority of the Russian people. What is represented to us as the dictatorship of the proletariat, if it were logically carried out and a class were able to exercise directly the dictatorship which is only possible for a party, would turn out to be the dictatorship of the peasants. It would therefore appear that the least painful transition to socialism is effected when it is carried out by the peasants. Although the peasants form the majority in the Soviet organizations, these do not include the whole of the proletariat. At first it was not clear who might organize in Soviets, and which Soviets might affiliate to the general organization. It was thought by various people that every trade organization might form a Soviet, and be regarded as such. On May 28, 1918, the Leipziger Volkszeitung published an article entitled "The Soviet Republic," which obviously came from Bolshevist sources. It was there stated, "The Soviet representation is superior to democratic representation. It concedes to all citizens full and equal rights, and all classes in the land enjoy the full possibility of securing representation in the Soviets, exactly corresponding to their strength and special social importance. To this end they must be independently organized, not in parties, as hitherto, on the lines of democracy, but in special classes or trade organizations." Legion and his friends may be very contented with this subordination of the Social Democratic Party to the trade unions, as well as the reactionaries who want to substitute a class vote for general suffrage. The champion of proletarian dictatorship continues. The bourgeoisie as such have hitherto not been represented in the Soviets, because on the one hand, they have boycotted them, and on the other, are not disposed to be organized on the proletarian scheme, but not because they have been excluded. Are they really not so disposed? Has our Bolshevist friend ever belonged to an employers' association, and does he think that the capitalist isolated under general suffrage is really more dangerous than an employers' association in a Soviet? But we are about to learn wherein consists the superiority of the Soviet organization over general suffrage. It can obviously adopt the attitude of excluding any bourgeois organization from the Soviets. In other words, the Soviet organization has the advantage over general suffrage of being more arbitrary. It can exclude all organizations which it considers obnoxious. It concedes full and equal rights to citizens, but obviously they must only be exercised to the liking of the Soviet government. Meanwhile, it has been discovered that this does not work. The last All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which terminated on July 12, 1918, drafted a constitution of the Russian Soviet Republic. This lays it down that not all the inhabitants of the Russian Empire, but only specified categories have the right to elect deputies to the Soviets. All those may vote who procure their sustenance by useful or productive work. What is useful and productive work? This is a very elastic term. Not less elastic is the definition of those who are excluded from the franchise. They include any who employ wage laborers for profit. A home worker or small master, with an apprentice, may live and feel quite like a proletarian, but he has no vote. Even more proletarians may become disfranchised by the definition which aims at depriving private traders and middlemen of the vote. The worker who loses his work, and endeavors to get a living by opening a small shop, or selling newspapers, loses his vote. Another clause excludes from the franchise everyone who has unearned income, for example, dividends on capital, profits of a business, rent of property. How big the unearned income must be which carries with it loss of the vote is not stated. Does it include the possession of a savings bank book? Quite a number of workers, especially in the small towns, own a little house, and, to keep themselves above water, let lodgings. Does this bring them into the category of people with unearned income? Not long since there was a strike at the Bolshevist factory, this hotbed of the revolution, as Trotsky styled it in 1909, Russia in the Revolution, page 83. I asked a Bolshevist comrade how he explained this protest against the Soviet government. That is very simple, he said, the workers there are all capitalists who own a little house. One sees how little it takes, according to the Constitution of the Soviet Republic, to be labeled a capitalist, and to lose the vote. The elasticity of the definition of the franchise, which opens the door to the greatest arbitrariness, is due to the subject of this definition, and not to its framers. A juridical definition of the proletariat, which shall be distinct and precise, is not to be had. I have not found a reference to the appointment of a specific authority which shall verify each person's vote, compile voting lists, and carry out the election, either by secret ballot or a show of hands. Clause 70 determines, the exact procedure of election will be decided by the local Soviets, in accordance with instructions from the All-Russian Central Committee. In a speech of April 28, 1918, Lenin mentioned the following in connection with the socialist character of the Soviets. 1. The voters are the working and exploited masses, only the bourgeoisie being excluded. 2. All bureaucratic formality and restriction cease. The masses themselves decide the procedure and the date of the elections. It seems, then, that anybody of electors may order the electoral procedure according to their whims. This would give the greatest scope for arbitrary action, and make it possible to get rid of any inconvenient element of opposition within the proletariat itself. It need only be remarked in passing that the election to the regional Soviet is an indirect one, which in any case makes easy the influencing of elections to the detriment of the opposition. However, this has not prevented the opposition from coming to expression in the Soviets. The least painful transition to socialism obviously requires the silencing of all opposition and criticism. So on June 14, 1918, the All-Russian Central Committee passed this resolution. The representatives of the Social Revolutionary Party, the right wing and the center, are excluded, and at the same time all Soviets of workers, soldiers, peasants, and Cossacks deputies are recommended to expel from their midst all representatives of this fraction. This measure was not directed against particular persons, who had committed some punishable acts. Anyone offending in this way against the existing order would at once be imprisoned, and there would be no need to exclude him. There is no word in the Constitution of the Soviet Republic respecting the immunity of deputies. Not particular persons, but particular parties, were thereby excluded from the Soviets. This means in practice nothing less than that all proletarians, who take their stand on the ground of party, lose their votes. Their votes are no longer counted. For this no specific clause exists. Clause 23 of the Constitution of the Soviet Republic determines, in the interests of the working class as a whole, the Russian Socialist Federal Soviet Republic may withdraw rights from any persons or groups who misuse them to the detriment of the socialist revolution. This declared the whole opposition to be outlaws. For every government, even a revolutionary one, discovers that the opposition misuse their rights. Yet even this was not sufficient to ensure the painless transition to socialism. Scarcely had the Bolsheviks got rid of the opposition of the Mensheviks and the center and right wing of the social revolutionaries within the Soviets, when the great fight broke out between them and the left social revolutionaries, with whom they had formed the government. The greater part of these were now driven out of the Soviets. So within the proletariat itself the circle of those who participate in political rights, upon whom the Bolshevist regime rests, becomes ever smaller. Starting out with the idea of establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, the Bolshevist regime was bound to become the dictatorship of a party within the proletariat. Yet it might be for a long time the dictatorship of the majority of the proletariat over the minority. Today even that has become doubtful. Nevertheless, every regime, even a dictatorship, is under the necessity of appearing to be the expression of the needs of the majority, not merely of the proletariat, but of the whole people. Even the Bolsheviks cannot escape from this. The Populaire of Paris, on July 6, 1918, reported an interview which Longuet had with Litvinov, the London Bolshevik ambassador. Among other things Longuet remarked, "You know, Citizen Litvinov, that even the comrades in the West, who have the strongest sympathy for your movement, are pained by the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. I had already told you this on my own account, when I last saw you in January. Do you not think that, in order to meet the attacks that are made on you, you ought at any rate to hold new elections?" To which Litvinov replied, "This is not possible at the moment in view of the present situation. Democracy expressed in the form of the Soviets, a more precise expression of the will of the masses, is the sole form of representation suitable to Russia at the present time. Besides, those who protested against the last Soviet elections, which were disastrous for them, would also oppose elections for a new assembly, in which we should certainly have the majority. If Comrade Litvinov and his friends are so sure of this, why do not they take steps to hold such elections? If these were held in the fullest freedom, and gave a Bolshevist majority, the existing government would gain a far stronger moral basis at home and abroad than ever it can win as a Soviet government on the present methods of election and administration. Above all, socialist critics would lose every ground of objection, and the whole international of the fighting proletariat would stand behind them with unanimity and with full force. Why renounce this enormous advantage if one is so sure of a majority? Because general suffrage is not suitable to Russia at the present time, and only the Soviet organization meets its requirements. But how can this assertion be proved? It is indeed understandable when one remembers that every government likes to identify itself with the country, and to declare that what does not suit it is also not suitable for the country. One thing can certainly be granted. The present situation is not favorable to the suggestion of elections to a constituent assembly. At the time when the elections to the first assembly were prepared and completed, a certain amount of peace still prevailed in the interior. Today all Russia is torn by civil war. Does, however, This record of 9 months of the Soviet Republic furnish the proof that the Soviet organization is the most suitable to Russia, and the one which least painfully affects the transition to socialism. Chapter 8. The Object Lesson. The pernicious features of the method of dictatorship here discussed must now be contrasted with more favorable aspects. It furnishes a striking object lesson, and even if it cannot last, it is able to accomplish many things to the advantage of the proletariat, which cannot be lost. Let us look closely at the object lesson. This argument obviously rests on the following consideration: under democracy, by virtue of which the majority of the people rule, socialism can only be brought about when a majority in its favor is gained. A long and tedious way. We reach our goal far quicker if an energetic minority which knows its aims, seizes hold of the power of the state, and use it for passing socialist measures. Its success would at once compel conviction, and the majority, which hitherto had opposed, would quickly rally to socialism. This sounds very plausible, and sounded so in the mouth of old Whiteling. It has only the one defect that it assumes that which has to be proved. The opponents of the method of dictatorship contest the assumption that socialist production can be brought about by a minority without the cooperation of the great mass of the people. If the attempt fails, it certainly is an object lesson, but in the wrong sense, not by attracting, but by frightening. People who are influenced by such an object lesson, and not by examining and verifying social relations, thoughtless worshippers of mere success, would, in the case of the attempt failing, not inquire from what causes it did not succeed. They would not seek for the explanation in the unfavorable or unripe conditions, but in socialism itself, and would conclude that socialism is realizable under no circumstances. It is apparent that the object lesson has a very dangerous side. How has it been represented to us? We may popularly express the essentials of socialism in the words, freedom and bread for all. This is what the masses expect from it, and why they rally to it. Freedom is not less important than bread. Even well-to-do and rich classes have fought for their freedom, and not seldom have made the biggest sacrifices for their convictions in blood and treasure. The need for freedom, for self-determination, is as natural as the need for food. Hitherto social democracy did represent to the masses of the people the object lesson of being the most tireless champion of the freedom of all who were oppressed, not merely the wage earner, but also of women, persecuted religions and races, the Jews, Negroes and Chinese. By this object lesson it has won adherents quite outside the circle of wage earners. Now, so soon as social democracy attains to power, this object lesson is to be replaced by one of an opposite character. The first step consists in the suspension of universal suffrage and of liberty of the press, the disenfranchisement of large masses of the people, for this must always take place if dictatorship is substituted for democracy. In order to break the political influence of the upper 10,000, it is not necessary to exclude them from the franchise. They exercise this influence not by their personal votes. As regards small shopkeepers, home workers, peasants who are well off and in moderate condition, the greater part of the intellectuals, so soon as the dictatorship deprives them of their rights, they are changed at once into enemies of socialism by this kind of object lesson, so far as they are not inimical from the beginning. Thus all those who adhere to socialism on the ground that it fights for the freedom of all would become enemies of the proletarian dictatorship. This method will win nobody who is not already a socialist. It can only increase the enemies of socialism. But we saw that socialism not only promised freedom, but also bread. This ought to reconcile those whom the communist dictatorship robbed of freedom. They are not the best of the masses who are consoled in their loss of freedom with bread and pleasure. But without doubt material well-being will lead many to communism who regard it sceptically, or who are by it deprived of their rights. Only this prosperity must really come, and that quickly, not as a promise for the future, if the object lesson is to be effective. How is this prosperity to be attained? The necessity for dictatorship presupposes that a minority of the population have possessed themselves of the power of the state. A minority composed of those who possess nothing. The greatest weapon of the proletariat is, however, its numbers, and in normal times it can only progress on these lines, conquering the political power only when it forms the majority. As a minority it can only achieve power by the combination of extraordinary circumstances, by a catastrophe which causes the collapse of a regime, and leaves the state helpless and impoverished. Under such circumstances, socialism, that is general well-being within modern civilization, would only be possible through a powerful development of the productive forces which capitalism brings into existence, and with the aid of the enormous riches which it creates and concentrates in the hands of the capitalist class. A state which by a foolish policy or by unsuccessful war has dissipated these riches, is by its nature condemned to be an unfavorable starting point for the rapid diffusion of prosperity in all classes. If, as the heir of the bankrupt state, not a democratic but a dictatorial regime enters into power, it even renders the position worse, as civil war is its necessary consequence. What might still be left in the shape of material resources is wasted by anarchy. In fine, the uninterrupted progress of production is essential for the prosperity of all. The destruction of capitalism is not socialism. Where capitalist production cannot be transformed at once into socialist production, it must go on as before, otherwise the process of production will be interrupted, and that hardship for the masses will ensue which the modern proletariat so much fears in the shape of general unemployment. In those places where, under the new conditions, capitalist production has been rendered impossible, socialist production will only be able to replace and if the proletariat has acquired experience in self-government, in trade unions, and on town councils, and has participated in the making of laws and the control of government, and if numerous intellectuals are prepared to assist with their services the new methods. In a country which is so little developed economically that the proletariat only forms a minority, such maturity of the proletariat is not to be expected. It may therefore be taken for granted that in all places where the proletariat can only maintain itself in power by a dictatorship, instead of by democracy, the difficulties with which socialism is confronted are so great that it would seem to be out of the question that dictatorship could rapidly bring about prosperity for all, and in this manner reconcile to the reign of force the masses of the people who are thereby deprived of political rights. As a matter of fact, we see that the Soviet Republic, after 9 months of existence, instead of diffusing general prosperity, is obliged to explain how the general poverty arises. We have lying before us, theses respecting the socialist revolution and the tasks of the proletariat during its dictatorship in Russia, which emanates from the Bolshevist side. A passage deals with the difficulties of the position. Paragraph 28 reads as follows, 28. The proletariat has carried out positive organic work under the greatest difficulties. The internal difficulties are, the wearing out and enormous exhaustion of the social resources and even their dissolution in consequence of the war, the policy of the capitalist class before the October Revolution, their calculated policy of disorganization, in order after the anarchy, to create a bourgeois dictatorship, the general sabotage of the bourgeoisie and the intellectuals after the October Revolution, the permanent counter-revolutionary revolts of the ex-officers, generals and bourgeois, with arms or without, lack of technical skill and experience on the part of the working class itself, italicized in original, lack of organizing experience, the existence of large masses of the petty bourgeoisie, which are an unorganized class, par excellence, etc. This is all very true. But it does not indicate anything else than that the conditions are not ripe. And does it not strikingly show that an object lesson on the lines of socialism is, under these conditions in present-day Russia, not to be thought of? It is a famous object lesson which makes it necessary for theoretical arguments to be set out why that which is to be shown is not possible at the moment. Will it convert those who have hitherto opposed socialism, and who are only to be convinced by its practical success? Of course, a new regime will come up against unexpected difficulties. It is wrong to lay the blame for them on this regime, as a matter of course, and to be discouraged by them without closer examination of the circumstances. But if one is to persevere, in spite of these difficulties, then it is necessary to win beforehand a strong conviction of the justice and necessity of this regime. Only then will confusion be avoided. Success worshippers are always uncertain Cantonists. So we are driven back upon democracy, which obliges us to strive to enlighten and convince the masses by intensive propaganda before we can reach the point of bringing socialism about. We must here again repudiate the method of dictatorship, which substitutes compulsory object lessons for conviction. This is not to say that object lessons may avail nothing in the realization of socialism. On the contrary, they can and will play a great part in this, but not through the medium of dictatorship. The various states of the world are at very different stages of economic and political development. The more a state is capitalistic on the one side and democratic on the other, the nearer it is to socialism. The more its capitalist industry is developed, the higher is its productive power, the greater its riches, the more socially organized its labor, the more numerous its proletariat, and the more democratic a state is, the better trained and organized is its proletariat. Democracy may sometimes repress its revolutionary thought, but it is the indispensable means for the proletariat to attain that ripeness which it needs for the conquest of political power, and the bringing about of the social revolution. In no country is a conflict between the proletariat and the ruling classes absent, but the more a country is progressive in capitalism mid-democracy, the greater is the prospect of the proletariat, in such a conflict, of not merely gaining a passing victory, but also of maintaining it. Where a proletariat, under such conditions, gains control of the state, it will discover sufficient material and intellectual resources to permit it at once to give the economic development a socialist direction, and immediately to increase the general well-being. This will then furnish a genuine object lesson to countries which are economically and politically backward. The mass of their proletariat will not unanimously demand measures on the same lines, and also all other sections of the poorer classes, as well as numerous intellectuals, will demand that the state should take the same road to general prosperity. Thus, by the example of the progressive countries, the cause of socialism will become irresistible in countries which today are not so advanced as to allow their proletariat of its own strength to conquer the power of the state, and put socialism into operation. And we need not place this period in the distant future. In a number of industrial states the material and moral prerequisites for socialism appear already to exist in sufficient measure. The question of the political dominion of the proletariat is merely a question of power alone, above all of the determination of the proletariat to engage in resolute class struggle. But Russia is not one of these leading industrial states. What is being enacted there now is, in fact, the last of bourgeois, and not the first of socialist revolutions. This shows itself ever more distinctly. Its present revolution could only assume a socialist character if it coincided with socialist revolutions in Western Europe. That by an object lesson of this kind in the more highly developed nations, the pace of social development may be accelerated, was already recognized by Marx in the preface to the first edition of Capital. One nation can and should learn from others. And even when a society has got upon the right track for the discovery of the natural laws of its movement, it can neither clear by bold leaps, nor remove by legal enactments the obstacles offered by the successive phases of its normal development. But it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs. In spite of their numerous calls on Marx, our Bolshevist friends seem to have quite forgotten this passage, for the dictatorship of the proletariat, which they preach and practice, is nothing but a grandiose attempt to clear by bold leaps or remove by legal enactments the obstacles offered by the successive phases of normal development. They think that it is the least painful method for the delivery of socialism, for shortening and lessening its birth pangs. But if we are to continue in metaphor, then their practice reminds us more of a pregnant woman, who performs the most foolish exercises in order to shorten the period of gestation, which makes her impatient, and thereby causes a premature birth. The result of such proceedings is, as a rule, a child incapable of life. Marx speaks here of the object lesson which one nation may afford another. Socialism is, however, concerned with yet another kind of object lesson, viz., that which a highly developed industry may furnish to an industry which is backward. To be sure, capitalist competition everywhere tends to displace old-fashioned industrial methods, but under capitalist conditions this is so painful a process that those threatened by its operation strive to avert it by all means. The socialist method of production would therefore find in existence a number of processes which are technically obsolete, for example, in agriculture, where large-scale production has made little progress, and in places is even receding. Socialist production can only develop on the basis of the large industry. Socialist agriculture would have to consist solely in the socialization of what large-scale production already exists. If good results are thereby obtained, which is to be expected, provided the social labor of freely organized men is substituted for wage labor, which only produces very inadequate results in agriculture, the conditions of the workers in the large socialist industry will be seen to be more favorable than those of the small peasants, and it may then be anticipated with certainty that the latter will voluntarily pass over to the new productive methods, when society furnishes them with the necessary means. But not before. In agriculture the way for socialism is not prepared by capitalism in any adequate measure. And it is quite hopeless to try to convince peasant proprietors of the theoretical superiority of socialism. Only the object lesson of the socialization of peasant agriculture can help. This, however, presupposes a certain extension of large-scale agriculture. The object lesson will be the quicker and more effective according to the degree of development of large-scale industry in the country. The policy of the petty bourgeois Democrats, which has been taken up by social democrats of the David School, and in some respects made more extreme, that is, the destruction of any large-scale agriculture and its partition into small-scale industry, is sharply opposed to socialism as applied to agriculture, and therefore to socialism as applied to society generally. The most striking feature of the present Russian Revolution is its working out on the lines of Eduard David. He, and not Lenin, has given the revolution its peculiar direction in this respect. That is the socialist instruction which it imparts. It testifies, in fact, to its bourgeois character. Chapter 9. The Legacy of the Dictatorship. Agriculture. Dictatorship is not only going to furnish the best object lesson for socialist propaganda, but will also hasten progress towards socialism, by its actions, in the event of its not maintaining itself and collapsing before the goal has been reached. Its supporters expect that it will leave behind much that cannot be set on one side, and that it has cleared out of the way much that cannot be again established. This conception, too, like so many others, is based on the observation of the great French Revolution, the bourgeois revolution, under the influence of which remain those who stigmatize as bourgeois, and reject all that does not suit them, and for whom democracy is only a bourgeois prejudice. The observation is correct, but the conclusions to be drawn are other than those of the supporters of dictatorship. The latter may be able to achieve more radical things than democracy, but what accompanies it is not always what the dictators want. However high the dictatorship may be raised above all other powers in the state, it is always dependent upon one of them, that is the material foundations of society. These conditions, and not the will of the dictators, decide what the final consequences of the dictatorship will be. The strongest driving force of the reign of terror in the French Revolution was the proletariat and the semi-proletarian classes of Paris. What they desired was the equalization of all property, the destruction of large properties. This they succeeded in doing in various ways. But they destroyed only more thoroughly than has happened in other parts of Europe the vestiges of feudalism, and thereby more effectively opened the way for the coming of the new capitalist large property, which shot up like a fungus immediately after the downfall of the reign of terror. That, and in no wise economic equality, was the legacy of that dictatorship of the equalitarians. In order to understand what the economic legacy of the present dictatorship of the Soviets will be, we must not only take account of their intentions, desires, and measures, but of the economic structure of the empire. It is decisive. This examination may appear to many as tedious pedantry, incompatible with the revolutionary fire which burned in a Marx. No one can say with certainty what Marx would have thought and done in the present situation. But it is certain that this tedious pedantry is the only procedure which is compatible with historical materialism, the foundation of which is one of the indisputable merits of Marx. A man who believed that in a question of knowledge mere enthusiasm was to be accounted higher than experience would have been pushed on one side by Marx as an empty phrase-monger. The economic foundation of present-day Russia is still agriculture, and even small peasant agriculture. By it live 4/5, perhaps even 5/6 of its inhabitants. In the year 1913 the town population of Russia, excluding Finland, was computed at 24 millions, and those living by the land were 147 millions. The overwhelming majority of the latter are peasants. The revolution has altered nothing in these conditions. During the past year they have even been strengthened. Numerous workers have returned to the land. In the towns hunger has been more devastating than amongst the peasants. Until the revolution the peasants lived under a semi-feudal yoke. Serfage had indeed been abolished by the reform of 1861, and the peasant formally made a free man. But this was not the work of a revolution, but the work of a patriarchal absolutism, which in a fatherly spirit provided that the big landowners should lose nothing by the reform, but should rather gain. The peasant had to pay for his freedom with the loss of a part of the land which, prior to the reform, he had used, and had to pay dear for the land which would be granted to him. The average size of a peasant's holding was certainly larger than in Western Europe. Before the revolution the peasants' holdings of less than 5 hectares in Russia comprised only 10.6% of the total, whereas in France 71.4% of the holdings were 5 hectares and less, and in Germany 76.5%. But Russian agriculture is so backward through the ignorance of the peasants, primitive appliances, lack of cattle and manure, that it produces far less than in Western Europe. In France 70.5 pud of wheat, 1 pud equals 16.38 kilograms, is raised from every hectare, in Germany 77 pud, but in Russia only 28.2 pud. Maslov, The Russian Agrarian Question. The peasant was therefore soon after his emancipation in a worse material position than before. He became impoverished, and his industry did not progress, but rather declined. To avoid starvation, he was obliged to rent plots of land from the large landowners, or, where these were themselves engaged in large-scale agriculture, to work for wages. Mostly, he was obliged to obtain an advance for the work he was to do, which brought him into a state of indebtedness that was often more oppressive and hopeless than his former serfdom. This state of affairs was not improved by the peasant taking his produce to the markets, whether home or foreign. This put money in his pocket, and made it possible for him to save, which could, however, only be done at the cost of the peasant's sustenance. Formerly, he had consumed the greater part of his produce himself, because he had no other outlet. Now that he found an outlet, he sold as much as possible, and kept as little as possible back. So every year of failure became a year of hunger. So far as the peasant could save money, he did not spend it to improve his methods, but to obtain more land. In the period between 1863 and 1892, agricultural land in European Russia was million rubles. Bought. Sold. By nobles. 821. 1,459. By merchants. 318. 135. By peasants. 335. 93. The land of the nobles decreased, and that of the peasants increased as compared with the bourgeoisie of the towns. But the land population increased more rapidly still, and so on the average there was a decrease in the area belonging to each peasant, although the total holdings of the peasants slightly increased. At the same time, under the influence of money transactions, aided by the legislature, the village communism, which from time to time had been instrumental in equalizing the land holdings of individual peasants, disappeared more and more. Individuals were prosperous, but the others were the more impoverished. Both, however, prosperous and poor peasants, looked ever more greedily to the great landowners, from whom they expected their salvation. They longed for the overthrow of landed property, and became a revolutionary class. Their longing found expression and form through the revolutionary intellectuals of the towns. The socialists of Russia were agreed that a revolution in the ownership of land was as essential for Russia as the overthrow of the Tsarist absolutism. But the socialists were divided into two sections. The one believed that primitive village communism would enable the peasants, and with them all Russia, to attain to socialism at one bound, although it may be a socialism of their own. This shade of opinion found various expressions, the chief being the social revolutionaries. The Marxists opposed them on the ground that Russia, as little as other countries, could clear by leaps or remove by legal enactments the obstacles offered by the successive phases of normal development, that the coming revolution could only clear away the vestiges of feudalism, and accelerate the capitalist development, on the basis of which would grow up a proletariat trained by the newly won democracy, which, then, being on the same level as the proletariat of Western Europe, would be able to achieve socialism at the same time as the latter. All socialists without distinction were agreed in supporting the peasants in their endeavors to remove the vestiges of feudalism. This was distinctly brought to the mind of the peasant in the Revolution of 1905. From then onwards the cooperation of peasants and socialists, namely, through the means of the social revolutionaries, assumed a closer character. Thus after the Revolution of 1917 the organization of the Soviets arose as not merely a proletarian, but also a peasant institution. The revolution made possession of large estates untenable. This became obvious at once. It was inevitable that they should be transferred to the peasant population, although there was by no means agreement as to the methods of carrying this out. Various solutions were conceivable. From the socialist standpoint, the most rational would have been to transform the large estates into state property, and have them worked on a cooperative basis by the peasants, who had hitherto been engaged on them as wage earners. However, this solution presupposed an agricultural class which Russia did not possess. Another solution would have been for the big landed estates to become state property, and to be divided into small parcels to be rented to the peasants who needed land. Even that would have been a partial realization of socialism. But the small peasant holders strove where they could to obtain full private property in their means of production. This character they have hitherto displayed everywhere, and the Russian peasant, in spite of the tradition of village communism, is no exception. The breaking up of landed estates and their partition, that was his program, and he was strong enough to carry it out. No one could hinder him. In the interests of the peasants themselves, it would have been nevertheless very desirable that the partition should be systematically carried out, and the land given to those who needed it the most, and could also use it. There was only one authority which could have effected such a systematic partition, and that was the Constituent Assembly, as representing the collective will of the nation, of whom the great majority were peasants. But this was too long to wait. The peasants began everywhere to help themselves, which caused many valuable productive implements to be destroyed. The Soviet organization then removed from the purview of the Constituent Assembly the settlement of the agrarian question, and left it to the peasants of every commune to seize the big estates, and proceed with their partition according to their whim. One of the first resolutions of the Soviet government ordered that private property in land is forthwith abolished, without compensation. The property of the landlords, together with the appurtenances, cloisters, and church property, with all livestock and chattels, and other belongings, pending the decision of the land question by the Constituent Assembly, shall be placed at the disposal of the local committees and the councils of peasants' deputies. The reference to the Constituent Assembly remained a dead letter. In practice, the peasants of the localities took what they wanted of the estates. This necessarily excluded any equalization between rich localities, containing many substantial peasants, and poor neighborhoods containing none but small peasants. Within the individual communes no record was made of those who obtained the land. Where the rich peasants dominated, either by their numbers or their influence, they obtained the lion's share of the big estates. No general statistics regarding the partition of the land were compiled, but it was frequently stated that, as a rule, the big peasants came away with most of the land that was partitioned. It is certain that the Soviet Republic has not solved the agrarian question on the lines of an equitable division of the land. At the beginning, the peasant Soviets constituted an organization of the peasants alone. Today it is announced that the Soviets represent the organization of the proletariat and the poor peasants. The well-to-do have lost their right of voting in the Soviets. The poor peasant is here recognized as the colossal and permanent product of the socialist agrarian reform of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This peasant is very likely in the minority in many villages, otherwise there was no object in protecting him by disfranchising the prosperous and medium peasants. But in any case he still forms a very considerable fraction of the Russian peasantry. By this partition of property the Soviet Republic sought to appease the peasants. It would have been dangerous for it to interfere even slightly with peasant private property. To be sure, it encroached on the relations between rich and poor peasants, but not by a fresh partition of the land. To remedy the lack of food in the towns, detachments of armed workers were sent into the villages, to take away from the rich peasants their surplus food. Part of this was assigned to the population of the towns, and part to the poor peasants. These were indeed only temporary measures of urgency, confined to certain areas, the environs of the large towns. To carry them out thoroughly, the armed force of the towns would have been quite inadequate. In no case could such measures have sufficed to effect an equalization between the rich and poor on the land, even if regularly repeated year by year. And in the last resort they might prove an effective means completely to ruin agriculture. If private production were carried on, and its produce calculated in such wise that the producer would have taken from him everything over what was necessary for his needs, he would produce only the indispensable minimum. This is one of the reasons for the decay of agriculture in many of the countries living under Oriental despotism, in which the tax collector takes from the peasant the surplus above that which is indispensable. A similar fate is likely to overtake Russia. Socialism will effect an adjustment between economic differences by the socialization of the means and methods of production, thus making society the owner of the products. By this means it is able to increase production to the maximum, and distribute the produce in accordance with social requirements and justice. On the other hand, to allow private property in the means of production, and private production itself to continue, and then regularly to confiscate the surplus, leads to the ruin of production, whether it be done in the interests of an Oriental despotism or of a proletarian dictatorship. Of course, in cases where such proceedings may be thought desirable as a temporary measure of urgency, this may not happen, as it may sometimes be necessary to do this. It is the reverse with the present expropriation of the well-to-do peasants. This does not alter in the least the structure of Russian society, it only introduces a new cause of unrest, and carries civil war into the domain of production, the continuance of which is so pressing a need for the government's peace and security. Moreover, if the dictatorship of the Soviets had the will and the strength to undertake a fresh partition of the land, and to do this equitably, it would not help the peasants much, as under the present primitive methods the cultivated land in Russia would not suffice to give enough land each peasant to raise him out of poverty. As Maslow rightly says in the book already quoted from, an attempt to put agriculture on the basis of equality would widely be realized as a state of general poverty. To try to make all rich, while maintaining private property in the means of production is a vulgar utopia of the petty bourgeoisie. If this kind of equality is not realizable, there is, on the other hand, in many countries, an equality of poverty already existing, and any extension of such a state of affairs can inspire no one. Whatever additions may be made to peasant property, there will always be too little land to permit all peasant be agriculture to prosperous. The endeavor to bring the life of the peasant into the orbit of the petty bourgeois ideal, economic equality of small property, is not only utopian, but also reactionary. With the present numbers of the population, and the existing area of cultivation, a general raising of the social standard of the Russian peasant cannot be accomplished by any method of partitioning the land. It can only be achieved when higher productive forms prevail, which require a general improvement in the education of the agricultural population, and a larger supply of cattle, implements, machinery, and artificial manure to be at their disposal, all of which conditions can only be introduced with difficulty and patience where small agriculture is the rule. If the conditions necessary for intensive capitalist agriculture have only been slightly developed in Russia, and have even suffered a temporary setback through the revolution, it is clear that the conditions for socialist agriculture do not exist there, as they can only arise on the basis of large-scale agriculture with highly developed technical appliances. Large-scale production can only be made to pay by technical appliances, the application of science, the most complete equipment of machinery, and the use of up-to-date methods, accompanied by a considerable division of labor. Therefore, new methods of production can only be introduced and become permanent in places where advantages can be derived, either in the form of an increased product or in that of the saving of labor. In view of the primitive appliances and the ignorance of the small Russian peasants, it is hopeless to introduce large-scale agriculture. To be sure, in Bolshevist circles, mention is made from time to time of the introduction of socialist agriculture, after the big estates have been broken up and divided amongst the peasants. We have already referred to the theses respecting the Russian Revolution and the tasks of the proletariat during its dictatorship in Russia. Number 24 of these reads, the complete expropriation of the landowners must be now mentioned. Land was decreed to exist for the general good. Additional tasks are the following: organization of agriculture by the state, collective working of the former big estates, association of the small holdings into larger unities, with collective self-government, so-called agricultural communes. This which was said to be the task is, unfortunately, not yet fulfilled. Collective agriculture is, for the time being, in Russia condemned to remain on paper. Nowhere, and at no time, are small peasants persuaded, on the ground of theory, to go in for collective production. The peasants' associations include all possible branches of economy, and not merely the fundamental one of cultivating the land. Small-scale agriculture necessarily creates everywhere the endeavor be separate single plots of land from one another, and is favorable to private property in land. Thus it has happened in Europe and America, and the process repeats itself throughout the world. Is the Russian peasant such an exceptional phenomenon as to be exempt from the operation of this general law? Whoever considers him as an ordinary man and compares him with the peasants of the rest of the world will declare it to be an illusion that a socialist economy can be built up on the basis of present Russian agriculture. The revolution has only achieved in Russia what it effected in France in 1789 and what its aftermath achieved in Germany. By the removal of the remains of feudalism, it has given stronger and more definite expression to private property than the latter had formerly. It has now made of the peasants, who were formerly interested in the overthrow of private property in land, that is, the big estates, the most energetic defenders of the newly created private property in land. It has strengthened private property in the means of production and in the produce, which are conditions from which capitalist production will constantly arise, although it may be disturbed or even destroyed for a time. Even the poor peasants are not thinking of giving up the principle of private property in land. Not by collective production do they seek to improve their lot, but by increasing their own share of land, that is, their own private property. That thirst for land, which always characterizes the peasant, has now, after the destruction of the big estates, made of him the strongest defender of private property. The peasant has shown himself to be such in all countries where feudalism has been overcome, and therefore is fostered and pampered by the ruling classes as their most trustworthy defender. This will be the most certain and lasting result of the present dictatorship of the proletariat and the poorest peasants in Russia. The interest of the peasant in the revolution therefore dwindles so soon as his new private property is secured. Lie will rise against any power which would re-establish at his cost the old, large landowners, but he has no interest in going beyond this. With his interest in the revolution will disappear his interest in his erstwhile allies, the town proletariat. The less the peasant produces for his own need and the more he produces for the market, and is obliged to rely upon his money income, so much the greater becomes his interest in high prices for his produce. This becomes his dominating interest after feudalism has been abolished. This does not, however, bring him into antagonism to the large landowners, whose interests are the same as his, and who become his allies, but it brings him into opposition to the non-agricultural and town population, above all, to the workers, who must spend a larger portion of their incomes upon food than the bourgeoisie, and consequently have the greatest interest in lowering the prices p1 the necessaries of life. So long as feudalism exists, the peasant and the lower classes in the towns make the best allies. This was shown in their struggles from the time of the German Peasants' War of 1525 to the time of the French Revolution of 1789. As soon as the bourgeois revolution was accomplished, the peasants commenced to go over to the camp which is opposed to the town proletariat. Not only the prosperous peasants are to be found there with the big landowners, but also the small peasants, even in democratic republics like Switzerland. The small peasants do not go over to the side all at once, but gradually, according as the traditions of feudalism become fainter, and production for the market replaces production for their own need. Even in our own ranks the idea has been cherished, which Marx also referred to in his writings on the Civil War in France, that the peasants in the coming proletarian revolution would march with the proletariat like they did in the bourgeois revolutions. Even yet the governmental socialists are looking for an agrarian program which will instill in the peasants an interest in the proletarian class struggle, but, in practice, growing opposition is everywhere revealed between the proletariat and the peasants. Only those dwellers in the country have the same interest as the town proletariat, who are themselves proletarians, that is, who do not live by the sale of their produce, but by the sale of their labor power, by wage labor. The victory of the proletariat depends upon the extension of wage labor in the country, which is a protracted process, a process which is slowly accomplished by the increase of large-scale agriculture, but more quickly promoted by the removal of industries to the country. At the same time, the proletarian victory depends upon the town and industrial population increasing more rapidly than the country and agricultural population. The latter is a process that goes rapidly forward. In most industrial states the country population suffers not only a relative, but an absolute decrease. In the German Empire the country population comprised 26.2 millions out of 41 millions, in 1871, that is, 64.4% of the population. In 1910 it was 25.8 out of 65 millions, or 40%. The agricultural population is smaller still than the country population. When the first occupation census was taken in 1882, the agricultural population was still 19.2 out of 45.2 millions, or 42.5% of the total population. In 1907 it was only 17.7 out of 61.7 millions, or 28.7%. Of these 17.7 millions only 11.6 millions were independent producers, 5.6 millions being wage earners and the rest officials. The peasant population, therefore, only amounts to 1/6 of the total population of the German Empire. On the other hand, already in 1907, the proletariat, with about 34 millions, comprised more than half of the population. Since then, it has certainly grown still more, and is not far off the point of becoming two-thirds of the population. The conditions in Russia are of quite another character. We have already shown how overwhelming is the preponderance of the peasants. Their cooperation with the proletariat has made possible the victory of the revolution, but it also testifies to the bourgeois character of the revolution. The more it is completed and strengthened in this sense, that is, the more secure the newly created peasant property is made, the more will the pound be prepared, on the one side for capitalist agriculture, and on the other for a growing opposition between the peasant and proletariat. The economic tendencies working in this direction are all powerful in present-day Russia, and the most forcible dictatorship would not avail to counteract them. Rather will it strengthen them in the shape of a dictatorship of the peasants. Industry. The industry of Russia is a different thing from its agriculture. Russian industry exhibits many primitive forms, but the capitalist portion of it, just because of its recent growth, shows its most modern and highly developed form. And the Russian industrial working class, by the side of numerous illiterates, who come from the country and are still limited by the narrow conceptions of the village, contains not a few members who have absorbed all the modern culture that is now available to the proletariat, who are filled with the same interest in theory which Marx praised in the German workers half a century ago, and are distinguished by that thirst for knowledge which is so often stifled amongst the workers of Western Europe by the petty details inherent in democratic conditions. Could not a socialist system of production be constructed on this foundation? This is only conceivable if socialism means that the workers in single factories and mines should appropriate these themselves, in order to administer each one separately. Even as I write, August 5th, a speech of Lenin's in Moscow, on August 2nd, is just to hand, which reports him as saying, "The workers retain possession of the factories and the peasants will not give back the land to the landlords." The saying "the factories to the workers and the land to the peasants" was recently not a social democratic, but an anarchist syndicalist demand. Social democracy demanded that the factories and land should belong to society. The individual peasant can, in case of need, work his property without any connection with other producers. The modern factory, on the other hand, stands in a network of social connections, and its isolation is inconceivable. It is not enough for the workers to take over a factory, even if they are sufficiently intelligent and trained to direct it properly. A factory cannot run for a single day without supplies from other industries, raw material, coal, and auxiliary products of all kinds, and without the regular sale of its products. Raw material and the mines and transport services fail, then the factory fails as well. Its operation on socialist lines presupposes the creation of a network of social production. Only when society can do this, is socialist production possible. Social democracy does not demand the transference of factories to their workers, but strives for social production, that is, production for the needs of society in place of commodity production, and this is only possible through the social ownership of the means of production. Even the Bolshevists have declared for the nationalization of factories, not their transference to the hands of the workers. The latter would only mean a change to a new form of capitalism, as experience has shown in the numerous cases of cooperative production. The new owners would defend their property, as giving them a privileged position, against laborers seeking work, whose numbers must constantly be recruited through the insufficient share of land falling to the peasantry. A permanent conquest of capitalism is not possible by giving over the factories to the workers engaged in them, but only by transferring the means of production to the possession of society, that is, the whole body of consumers, for whose need production is carried on. Thus they become state property, or, in the case of local means of production, belong to the commune, and eventually also to associations of consumers. This has even been attempted in Russia today. How far it has been carried out is not yet disclosed. This side of the Soviet Republic is, in any case, of the greatest interest for us, but, unfortunately, we are still completely in the dark. There is, indeed, no lack of decrees, but trustworthy information concerning the operation of the decrees is absent. Socialist production is impossible without comprehensive, detailed, reliable statistics, which give early information. Hitherto, the Soviet Republic has not been able to obtain these. What we learn about its economic effects is highly contradictory and is not susceptible of any verification. This is again one of the results of the dictatorship and the suppression of democracy. Where freedom of the press and speech is lacking, there can be no central and representative body, in which all classes and parties are represented, and can express themselves, and the actual dictatorship is exposed to the temptation of only allowing to be published the information which suits it. Whether or not the dictators take advantage of this possibility, no reliance is placed on their information. This does not silence criticism, which merely seeks underground channels. It is spread by word of mouth almost as quickly as a public announcement, but without the restraint of publicity. Rumor knows no bounds. Thus, we are overwhelmed from left to right with information which is contradictory, and we are obliged to maintain an attitude of distrust towards it all. What results have been forthcoming from the socialist endeavors of the Soviet government cannot, therefore, yet be estimated, not even approximately. Is it possible for it to accomplish something in this respect, which will not again be lost, but will become permanent, in the event of the Soviet government not being able to retain its power? That it has radically destroyed capitalism can be accepted by no one. It can certainly destroy much capitalist property, and transform many capitalists into proletarians, but this is not equivalent to the establishment of a socialist system of production. So far as it does not succeed in doing this, capitalism will again arise, and must arise. Probably it will reappear very quickly and bring a change in the personnel of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the place of the former capitalists, now become proletarians, will enter proletarians or intellectuals become capitalists. These people will always skim off the cream, and will remain on the side of the government which is last on the field, and brings order out of chaos. The Soviet government has already been constrained to make various compromises with capital. On April 28, 1918, Lenin admitted in his before-quoted speech, reported in the news service of the International Socialist Commission, that the expropriation of capital had proceeded too quickly. If we are to expropriate at this pace, we shall be certain to suffer a defeat. The organization of production under proletarian control is notoriously very much behind the expropriation of the big masses of capital. But everything depends upon this organization. There is nothing easier for a dictator than to expropriate. But to create a huge organism of social labor, and set it in motion, a decree and the Red Guard will not suffice. Even more than Russian capital, German capital will cause the Soviet Republic to recoil and recognize its claims. How far the capital of the Entente will again penetrate into Russia is still questionable. To all appearance, the dictatorship of the proletariat has only destroyed Russian capital in order to make room for German and American capital. However this may be, it is reasonable to anticipate that the nationalization of many branches of industry, for which the Soviet government has paved the way, will persist, even if the Soviet Republic should be destroyed, and, after the destruction of the big estates, this will constitute the most considerable permanent achievement of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is all the more probable, as it is part of a movement which is going on in all modern states, even if they are capitalist. The needs of the war were responsible for it. We remember the nationalization of the American railways, and the needs of peace will ensure its continuance. Everywhere we must be prepared for fiscal monopoly. But this shows that nationalization is shot yet socialism. Whether it is so or not depends on the character of the state. Now the Russian state is a peasant state. It is so today more than ever, for the peasant has now learned to make his own power felt. In Russia he is as little as elsewhere in a position to exercise his power directly in the state, as his conditions of life do not fit him for this. but he will no longer suffer the rule of any power which does not champion his interest, even if it be that of the town proletariat. Like peasant commodity production, the state industries will also have to produce for the market, not for the state's own needs. Their most considerable market, the home one, will comprise the peasants. Even as much as he is interested in high prices for agricultural produce, which he sells, is the peasant interested in low prices for industrial products, which he buys. As against private enterprise, it is a matter of indifference to him how these low prices come to pass, whether at the expense of labor or of profit. He has no interest in high profits for private industrial capital. It is, however, otherwise with state industry. The higher the profits of this, the lower is the amount of revenue to be provided by taxes, which, in a peasant state, must be chiefly borne by the peasants. The peasant is accordingly as much interested in high profits for state industry as he is in low prices for its products. This means lower wages for labor. Thus we see here another source of antagonism between peasant and industrial worker, an antagonism which will become the more marked the greater the extension which state industry undergoes. This antagonism, and not socialism, will be the real legacy of the Russian Revolution. It would, nevertheless, be false to ascribe the responsibility for this to Bolshevism. Much of what they are reproached with is the necessary consequence of the conditions which confronted them, and would have disclosed itself quite as certainly under any other regime. Yet it is of the essence of dictatorship that it intensifies all existing antagonisms and raises them to their highest point. The famine has not been created by the dictatorship, but by the mismanagement of Tsarism and the war. But the fact that agriculture and the transport services have so slightly recovered 3.5 years following peace is the result of the civil war, which, under the dictatorship, is the only form of opposition, and is inevitable when the masses cherish lively political interest. Again, the demobilization of the army was a process which the Bolsheviks found going on. Yet they have prided themselves on accelerating it to the utmost, and thereby were obliged to conclude a peace which is no longer a source of satisfaction to them. In the same way, the breaking up of the big estates among the peasants was a proceeding which had already started before the Bolsheviks seized the political power, and which, owing to the overwhelming numbers of the peasants, nobody could have hindered. Yet the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly has contributed to it, in that the last trace of social influence on the assignment of the expropriated big estates has been lost, and the partition has been left to the naked arbitrariness of the interests on the spot. Finally, the appearance of the antagonism between peasant and industrial worker is also a phenomenon which could not be avoided, and which necessarily arises out of the prevailing economic conditions. Yet even here the Bolshevist rule has forced the growth of conditions which have sharpened and deepened the antagonism. With the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and the demobilization of the army, the two factors disappeared which could have furnished Russia with the quickest protection against the breaking up and partition of the land. Precisely the richest agricultural tracts of former Russia are now detached from it. If they so remain, then Russia will cease, especially if Siberia also separates, to be altogether a corn or food exporting country. The prices of the agricultural produce of Russia will then be determined only by the home, and not by the foreign market. Now this is the condition in which, under commodity production, the opposition between peasant and industrial worker most quickly develops. In countries which largely export agricultural produce, the opposition between industry and agriculture takes the form of an antagonism of states rather than of classes, the form of an antagonism between an industrial state and an agricultural state. Russia, in particular, has now, through the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, ceased to be an agricultural exporting state, and has shaped in such a way as to promote the most rapid and bitter economic struggle between peasants and industrial workers. In any case, this struggle cannot be avoided. So much the more important is it for a far-seeing policy to give such a form to the conditions in which the struggle must be carried on as to make possible to the proletariat the best development of its strength. To lay these foundations, not only as against capital, but also as against agriculture. This was, during the revolution, the most important task of the representatives of the Russian proletariat. Nothing else than the secure establishment of democracy could have done this. This task of the proletarian struggle for freedom, which is not less important than the institution of social production, is, in contrast to the latter, practicable in an agrarian state. The peasants, like all sections of the working class, demand democracy. They may find themselves very well off in a democratic republic, as is shown in Switzerland and the United States, but the political interests of the peasant seldom extend beyond the confines of his village, in contrast with the industrial proletarian, whose emancipation requires him to dominate the whole machinery of the state, which can be no local act. The peasant can also become enthusiastic for an emperor, who protects his property and fosters his interest, as he did in the case of Napoleon I. The Russian peasant would oppose any return of the Tsarist regime, which in his eyes was connected with the return of the old, deadly hated landlords. But a dictator, who secured him in his property, and allowed him to devote all his attention to the cultivation of his fields and the sale of their produce, such a dictator might under circumstances be as welcome to him as the republic. For this dictator the way has been prepared by the suspension of democracy, and the proclamation of the dictatorship of a class, which is in reality the dictatorship of a party, and, as Lenin himself has stated, can become the dictatorship of a single person. In his speech of April 28 he said, "The closer we approach the complete suppression of the bourgeoisie, the more dangerous the factor of petty bourgeois anarchism will be for us. The struggle against it can only be carried on by force. If we are no anarchists, we must recognize the necessity of a state, that is a forcible transition from capitalism to socialism. The kind of force will be determined by the degree of the development of the revolutionary class concerned, as well as by special circumstances, such as reactionary war and the form taken by the opposition of the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie. Therefore no essential contradiction can exist between the Soviet, that is, the socialist democracy, and the exercise of dictatorial power by a single person. In the long run nothing can be more dangerous to the Russian proletariat than to familiarize the peasant with the idea that dictatorship, the disfranchising of all opponents, the suspension of the suffrage, and of freedom of the press and of organization as regards every antagonistic class, is the form of government which corresponds to the interests of the working classes. What will then become of the town workers if they come into conflict with the enormous mass of the Russian peasants and a dictator who is recognized by them? And what will become of the workers when their own dictatorship collapses? The alternative to the dictatorship of a party is its destruction. Dictatorship impels the party which is in possession of power to maintain it by all means, whether fair or foul, because its fall means its complete ruin. With democracy it is quite otherwise. Democracy signifies rule of the majority, and also protection of the minority, because it means equal rights and an equal share in all political rights for everybody, to whatever class or party he may belong. The proletariat everywhere has the greatest interest in democracy. Where the proletariat represents the majority, democracy will be the machinery for its rule. Where it is in the minority, democracy constitutes its most suitable fighting arena in which to assert itself, win concessions, and develop. If a proletariat which is in a minority attains to power, in alliance with another class, through a momentary conjunction of forces, it is most short-sighted real politics, that is, politics of the passing moment, to endeavor to perpetuate this position by the suppression of democracy and the rights of minorities in opposition. It would destroy the ground on which alone a firm footing could be retained, after the passing of this phase, for further work and an extended struggle. It is problematical whether the Russian proletariat has now gained more real and practical acquisitions through the decrees of the Soviet Republic than it would have gained through the Constituent Assembly, in which socialists, even if of another color than those in the Soviets, predominated. But it is certain that if the Soviet Republic collapse, many of its achievements are likely to fall along with it. Had the Constituent Assembly succeeded in strengthening democracy, then, at the same time, all the advantages which the industrial proletariat might have acquired by its agency would have been consolidated. Today we rest our expectations that the Russian proletariat will not be cheated of all the fruit of the revolution only on the supposition that the dictatorship will not succeed in stifling democratic consciousness in the Russian people, and that, after all the errors and confusions of the civil war, democracy will finally be triumphant. Not in dictatorship, but in democracy, lies the future of the Russian proletariat. Chapter X. The New Theory. We have seen that the method of dictatorship does not promise good results for the proletariat, either from the standpoint of theory or from that of the special Russian conditions. Nevertheless, it is understandable only in the light of these conditions. The fight against Tsarism was for a long time a fight against a system of government which bad ceased to be based on the conditions prevailing, but was only maintained by naked force, and only by force was to be overthrown. This fact would easily lead to a cult of force even among the revolutionaries, and to overestimating what could be done by the powers over them, which did not repose on the economic conditions, but on special circumstances. Accordingly, the struggle against Tsarism was carried on secretly, and the method of conspiracy created the manners and the habits proper to dictatorship, and not to democracy. The operation of these factors was, however, crossed by another consequence of the struggle against absolutism. We have already referred to the fact that, in contradistinction to democracy, which awakens an interest for wider relations and greater objects side by side with its constant preoccupations with momentary ends, absolutism arouses theoretical interest. There is today, however, only one revolutionary theory of society, that of Karl Marx. This became the theory of Russian socialism. Now what this theory teaches is that our desires and capabilities are limited by the material conditions, and it shows how powerless is the strongest will which would rise superior to them. It conflicted sharply with the cult of mere force, and caused the Social Democrats to recognize that definite boundaries were set to their participation in the coming revolution, which, owing to the economic backwardness of Russia, could only be a bourgeois one. Then the Second Revolution came, and suddenly brought a measure of power to the socialists which surprised them, for this revolution led to the complete demobilization of the army, which was the strongest support of property and bourgeois order. And at the same time as the physical support collapsed, the moral support of this order went to pieces, neither the church nor the intellectuals being able to maintain their pretensions. The rule devolved on the lower classes in the state, the workers and peasants, but the peasants do not form a class which is able itself to govern. They willingly permitted themselves to be led by a proletarian party, which promised them immediate peace, at whatever price, and immediate satisfaction of their land hunger. The masses of the proletariat rallied to the same party, which promised them peace and bread. Thus the Bolshevist party gained the strength which enabled it to seize political power. Did this not mean that at length the prerequisite was obtained which Mann and Engels had postulated for the coming of socialism, viz., the conquest of political power by the proletariat? In truth, economic theory discountenanced the idea that socialist production was realizable at once under the social conditions of Russia, and not less unfavorable to it was the practical confirmation of this theory, that the new regime in no way signified the sole rule of the proletariat, but the rule of a coalition of proletarian and peasant elements, which left each section free to behave as it liked on its own territory. The proletariat put nothing in the way of the peasants as regards the land, and the peasants put no obstacle in the way of the proletariat as regards the factories. Nonetheless, a socialist party had become the ruler in a great state, for the first time in the world's history. Certainly a colossal and, for the fighting proletariat, a glorious event. But for what can a socialist party use its power except to bring about socialism? It must at once proceed to do so, and, without thought or regard, clear out of the way all obstacles which confront it. If democracy thereby comes in conflict with the new regime, which, in spite of the great popularity which it so quickly won, cannot dispose of a majority of the votes in the empire, then so much the worse for democracy. Then it must be replaced by dictatorship, which is all the easier to accomplish, as the people's freedom is quite a new thing in Russia, and as yet has struck no deep roots amongst the masses of the people. It was now the task of dictatorship to bring about socialism. This object lesson must not only suffice for the elements in its own country which are still in opposition, but must also compel the proletariat of other capitalist countries to imitation, and provoke them to revolution. This was assuredly a train of thought of outstanding boldness and fascinating glamour for every proletarian and every socialist. What we have struggled for during half a century, what we have so often thought ourselves to be near, what has always again evaded us, is at length going to be accomplished. No wonder that the proletarians of all countries have hailed Bolshevism. The reality of proletarian rule weighs heavier in the scale than theoretical considerations. And that consciousness of victory is still more strengthened by mutual ignorance of the conditions of the neighbor. It is only possible for a few to study foreign countries, and the majority believe that in foreign countries it is at bottom the same as with us, and when this is not believed, very fantastic ideas about foreigners are entertained. Consequently, we have the convenient conception that everywhere the same imperialism prevails, and also the conviction of the Russian socialists that the political revolution is as near to the peoples of Western Europe as it is in Russia, and, on the other hand, the belief that the conditions necessary for socialism exist in Russia as they do in Western Europe. What happened, once the army had been dissolved and the assembly had been proscribed, was only the consequence of the step that had been taken. All this is very understandable, if not exactly encouraging. On the other hand, it is not so conceivable why our Bolshevist comrades do not explain their measures on the ground of the peculiar situation in Russia, and justify them in the light of the pressure of the special circumstances, which, according to their notions, left no choice but dictatorship or abdication. They went beyond this by formulating quite a new theory, on which they based their measures, and for which they claimed universal application. For us the explanation of this is to be found in one of their characteristics, for which we should have great sympathy, viz., their great interest in theory. The Bolshevists are Marxists, and have inspired the proletarian sections coming under their influence with great enthusiasm for Marxism. Their dictatorship, however, is in contradiction to the Marxist teaching that no people can overcome the obstacles offered by the successive phases of their development by a jump, or by legal enactment. How is it that they find a Marxist foundation for their proceedings? They remembered opportunely the expression, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Marx used in a letter written in 1875. In so doing he had, indeed, only intended to describe a political condition, and not a form of government. Now this expression is hastily employed to designate the latter, especially as manifested in the rule of the Soviets. Now if Marx had somewhere said that under certain circumstances things might come to a dictatorship of the proletariat, he has described this condition as one unavoidable for the transition to socialism. In fact, as he declared, almost at the same time that in countries like England and America a peaceful transition to socialism was possible, which would only be on the basis of democracy and not of dictatorship, he has also shown that he did not mean by dictatorship the suspension of democracy. Yet this does not disconcert the champions of dictatorship. As Marx once stated that the dictatorship of the proletariat might be unavoidable, so they announced that the Soviet Constitution, and the disfranchising of its opponents, was recognized by Marx himself as the form of government corresponding to the nature of the proletariat, and indissolubly bound up with its rule. As such it must last as long as the rule of the proletariat itself, and until socialism is generally accomplished and all class distinctions have disappeared. In this sense dictatorship does not appear to be a transitory emergency measure, which, so soon as calmer times have set in, will again give place to democracy, but as a condition for the long duration of which we must adapt ourselves. This interpretation is confirmed by Theses 9 and 10 respecting the social revolution, which state: Hitherto, the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat was taught, without inquiring as to the form it would take. The Russian Socialist Revolution has discovered this form. It is the form of the Soviet Republic as the type of the permanent dictatorship of the proletariat and, in Russia, of the poorer classes of peasants. It is therefore necessary to make the following remarks. We are speaking now, not of a passing phenomenon, in the narrower sense of the word, but of a particular form of the state during the whole historical epoch. What needs now to be done is to organize a new form of the state, and this is not to be confused with special measures directed against the bourgeoisie, which are only functions of a special state organization appropriate to the colossal tasks and struggle. The proletarian dictatorship accordingly consists, so to speak, in a permanent state of war against the bourgeoisie. It is also quite clear that all those who cry out about the violence of the communists completely forget what dictatorship really is. The revolution itself is an act of naked force. The word dictatorship signifies in all languages nothing less than government by force. The class meaning of force is here important, for it furnishes the historical justification of revolutionary force. It is also quite obvious that the more difficult the situation of the revolution becomes, the sharper the dictatorship must be. From the above it is also apparent that dictatorship as a form of government is not only to be a permanent thing, but will also arise in all countries. If in Russia now the newly acquired general freedom is put an end to again, this must also happen after the victory of the proletariat in countries where the people's freedom is already deeply rooted, where it has existed for half a century and longer, and where the people have won it and maintained it in frequent bloody revolutions. The new theory asserts this in all earnestness. And stranger still, it finds support not only amongst the workers of Russia, who still remember the yoke of the old Tsardom, and now rejoice to be able to turn the handle for once, even as apprentices when they become journeymen rejoice when they may give the apprentices who come after them the drubbing they used to receive themselves. No, the new theory finds support even in old democracies like Switzerland. Yet something stranger still and even less understandable is to come. A complete democracy is to be found nowhere, and everywhere we have to strive after modifications and improvements. Even in Switzerland there is an agitation for the extension of the legislative powers of the people, for proportional representation and for woman suffrage. In America the power and mode of selection of the highest judges need to be very severely restricted. Far greater are the demands that should be put forward by us in the great bureaucratic and militarist states in the interests of democracy. And in the midst of these struggles, the most extreme fighters raise their heads, and say to the opponents, that which we demand for the protection of minorities, the opposition, we only want so long as we ourselves are the opposition, and in the minority. As soon as we have become the majority, and gained the power of government, our first act will be to abolish as far as you are concerned all that we formerly demanded for ourselves, viz., franchise, freedom of press and of organization, etc. The theses respecting the socialist revolution are quite unequivocal on this point. The former demands for a democratic republic, and general freedom, that is freedom for the bourgeoisie as well, were quite correct in the epoch that is now past, the epoch of preparation and gathering of strength. The worker needed freedom for his press, while the bourgeois press was noxious to him, but he could not at this time put forward a demand for the suppression of the bourgeois press. Consequently, the proletariat demanded general freedom, even freedom for reactionary assemblies, for black labor organizations. Now we are in the period of the direct attack on capital, the direct overthrow and destruction of the imperialist robber state, and the direct suppression of the bourgeoisie. It is therefore absolutely clear that in the present epoch the principle of defending general freedom, that is also for the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie, is not only superfluous, but directly dangerous. This also holds good for the press, and the leading organizations of the social traders. The latter have been unmasked as the active elements of the counter-revolution. They even attack with weapons the proletarian government. Supported by former officers and the money bags of the defeated finance capital, they appear on the scene as the most energetic organizations for various conspiracies. The proletariat dictatorship is their deadly enemy. Therefore, they must be dealt with in a corresponding manner. As regards the working class and the poor peasants, these possess the fullest freedom. Do they really possess the fullest freedom? The social traders are proletarians and socialists, too, but they offer opposition, and are therefore to be deprived of rights like the bourgeois opposition. Would we not display the liveliest anger, and fight with all our strength in any case where a bourgeois government endeavored to employ similar measures against its opposition? Certainly we should have to do so, but our efforts would only have a laughable result if the bourgeois government could refer to socialist precepts like the foregoing, and a practice corresponding with them. How often have we reproached the liberals that they are different in government from what they are in opposition, and that then they abandon all their democratic pretensions. Now the liberals are at least sufficiently prudent to refrain from the formal abandonment of any of their democratic demands. They act according to the maxim, one does this, but does not say so. The authors of the theses are undeniably more honorable, whether they are wiser may be doubted. What would be thought of the wisdom of the German Social Democrats, if they openly announced that the democracy, for which they fight today, would be abandoned the day after victory? That they have perverted their democratic principles to their opposites, or that they have no democratic principles at all, that democracy is merely a ladder for them, up which to climb to governmental omnipotence, a ladder they will no longer need, and will push away, as soon as they have reached the top, that, in a word, they are revolutionary opportunists. Even for the Russian revolutionaries it is a short-sighted policy of expediency, if they adopt the method of dictatorship, in order to gain power, not to save the jeopardized democracy, but in order to maintain themselves in spite of it. This is quite obvious. On the other hand, it is less obvious why some German social democrats who are not yet in power, who furthermore only at the moment represent a weak opposition, accept this theory. Instead of seeing something which should be generally condemned in the method of dictatorship, and the disfranchising of large sections of the people, which at the most is only defensible as a product of the exceptional conditions prevailing in Russia, they go out of their way to praise this method as a condition which the German social democracy should also strive to realize. This assertion is not only thoroughly false, it is in the highest degree destructive. If generally accepted, it would paralyze the propagandist strength of our party to the utmost, for, with the exception of a small handful of sectarian fanatics, the entire German, as also the whole proletariat of the world, is attached to the principle of general democracy. The proletariat would angrily repudiate every thought of beginning its rule with a new privileged class, and a new disfranchised class. It would repudiate every suggestion of coupling its demand for general rights for the whole people with a mental reservation, and in reality only strive for privileges for itself. And not less would it repudiate the comic insinuation of solemnly declaring now that its demand for democracy is a mere deceit. Dictatorship as a form of government in Russia is as understandable as the former anarchism of Bakunin. But to understand it does not mean that we should recognize it, we must reject the former as decisively as the latter. The dictatorship does not reveal itself as a resource of a socialist party to secure itself in the sovereignty which has been gained in opposition to the majority of the people, but only as means of grappling with tasks which are beyond its strength, and the solution of which exhausts and wears it, in doing which it only too easily compromises the ideas of socialism itself, the progress of which it impedes rather than assists. Happily, the failure of the dictatorship is not synonymous with the collapse of the revolution. It would be so only if the Bolshevist dictatorship was the mere prelude to a bourgeois dictatorship. The essential achievements of the revolution will be saved, if dictatorship is opportunely replaced by democracy.